Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this conversation about the Vice President's Cancer Moonshot. My name is Kathy Hudson. I'm the Deputy Director for Science, Outreach, and Policy at the National Institutes of Health. And joining me today is a diverse panel of folks with varying perspectives and backgrounds and expertise to engage in a conversation. On my far right is Anna Barker. She is at the Arizona State University, where she directs the National Biomarker Development Alliance and as a professor in the School of Life Sciences. Next to her is Michelle Bennett, who is the director for the Center for Research Strategy at the National Cancer Institute. They are clearly playing a leading role in helping shape the Cancer Moonshot. To my left is Bob Bradway, Chairman and CEO of Amgen. To his left is Lou DeGennaro, which I always trip over, who's the president and CEO of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And then finally, on the far left is Isla Garraway. She's associate professor and director of research at the Department of Urology at the University of California, Los Angeles, a physician and surgeon. And so we have a multitude of perspectives here to participate in this conversation of the moonshot and where we are. So I thought I would start out and give you a little bit of a background of where this came from. And then I'm going to turn to Greg Simon, who has recently been named the executive director for the Moonshot Task Force. Everybody has a special outfit to be on that task force. It looks a little like a spacesuit. To tell us sort of where we're going, and then we'll have a conversation up here. So on October 21st of last year, the vice president in the Rose Garden, surrounded by his wife and the president, announced that he would not run for president and said that he's going to spend the next 15 months in this office pushing as hard as I can to accomplish real progress in cancer. A couple months later, in the State of the Union on January 12th, the president asked Biden to head up mission control for the Cancer Moonshot. He looked surprised when the president turned to him. It was an amusing moment. A couple weeks later, the president released a memo forming this Cancer Moonshot Task Force. And if you haven't looked at that memo, I would encourage you to. It sort of lays out the president's vision of what is going to take place in these final months of this administration in order to lay the groundwork for this moonshot. And it specifically lays out areas of increasing understanding of cancer, enhancing patient access and care, knocking down barriers to data access and data sharing, catalyzing public-private partnerships where those can be appropriate to move things forward, and knocking down barriers to getting new treatments and new preventions available to patients. Soon after that, the White House put out a fact sheet and set forward these themes that we'll talk about today, and also proposed $1 billion for the Cancer Moonshot, with a little bit from FY16 funds, but the majority of that being proposed to the Congress for FY17. So that's a substantial, even for the National Cancer Institute and other agencies that are already investing heavily in cancer research. This was a substantial proposed increase. And so what we really want to talk about is how we can use that and other program and policy levers to really move the ball forward. So with that, I want to call on Greg to say a few words about sort of what kind of vision you're bringing to this enterprise and what you're hoping to accomplish with the task force. And if he could get oh, you got one. There you go.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you all for being here. First, get over the moonshot metaphor discussion. It's actually a very good metaphor for one simple reason. When Kennedy said we were going to go to the moon, he didn't say we're going to study moonography. He didn't say we're going to study rocketry. He said we're going to take a human being, put them on the moon, bring them back safely. And he put a human being at the center of all of the space activities. And that's what we have to do in cancer. We have to put human beings at the center of every activity and get us through our lives without us being affected or killed by cancer before a natural time. The Cancer Moonshot, also the moonshot's a great metaphor because we're not trying to do the normal, we're not trying to do the ordinary. For something to be moonshotty, to be moonshot-like, means it needs to really make a difference in changing the way we do things, in changing the way we escape the bureaucratic gravity that's been built up since the 50s. Everything in your life has changed since the 50s except the way we fund medical research. So it's time to stop complaining about it and start figuring out how do we take our great resources, financial, human capital, technology, and make a difference in some critical areas, sharing data about patients from the moment it's generated and through clinical trials and through research into their genes, their patient history, et cetera, their family history. How do we generate that data in a valid and exciting way that actually can be shared quickly? How do we get patients involved at the beginning of clinical trials, at the beginning of research ideas? How do we deal with the disparities issue we have around the world, not just in America, where you live determines whether you live? People do not get the same care in this country based on where they live. How do we deal with the different systems that we have, the DOD, the Veterans Administration, and how do we deal with the fact that only 3 to 4% of cancer patients are in cancer trials? That number was a multiple for children's cancer trials, which is why we've made so much progress on children's cancers. So we have to ask the patients about clinical trials, not just ask each other. And I would say many of you probably are patients. I'm a survivor of leukemia. I have a friend who's a survivor of prostate cancer. We have Kathy over here who's a survivor of multiple myeloma. We all have something that we've dealt with. And now the question is, how do we put that common experience together to really change not just what we're funding, but how we're funding it, who we're funding, and how we operate? Because at the end of the day, the problem is us. The problem is culture. And we can change the culture, but only if we admit at the very beginning that it's our problem. Cancer's been smarter than us. It started a long time ago. We're just catching up to it. And if we're going to deal with it, we have to deal with it in a new way. Because the old way, while it has made progress, is not going to make progress as fast as cancer will. So with that, I really look forward to hearing the ideas from these very talented people today, and your ideas as well, and I appreciate you all having an interest in this.
Great, thanks, Greg. So the areas that the White House fact sheet about the Cancer Moonshot laid out were in prevention, in early detection, in immunotherapy and combination trials, in genomics, in data sharing, and with a special emphasis on pediatrics. And Greg, you talked about putting a person at the middle in order to break through this weight of gravity. And Lou, I wanted to turn to you and have you share a little bit about how are we presently putting people in the middle, and how could we do a better job at that with the Moonshot?
Thank you, Kathy. It's never a good time to get cancer, but I think today's a phenomenal time to be fighting it. So the juxtaposition of the technologies, our deep understanding of the cancer genome, the tremendous output from the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry with new and very innovative targeted therapies, all coming together to make this a tremendous opportunity to move forward. I think the answer to your question is we're not being very successful at putting patients at the center of that. And I loved Greg's comments. We really need to do that. I can share with you, we brought a group of acute myeloid leukemia patients to the FDA about 3 weeks ago to speak directly with the FDA. And Dr. Pazder, Ann Farrell, Dr. Pazder's direct reports, and about 15 or 20 FDA staffers were there for a 4-hour session with these patients. And it was a true dialogue. So this gives me great hope that there is an opportunity to bring patients into the center. We have to think differently about how we design clinical trials. Mm-hmm. Right now, they're experiments, and we think about participants as subjects. No wonder only 5% of cancer patients enroll in clinical trials. We have to engage them sooner. We have to get the patient preferences integrated into the clinical trial design, and it has to make sense for the patient in order to raise the level of participation. Greg made a great point. In the 1960s, pediatric oncologists agreed to do two things. They agreed to put every child, every newly diagnosed acute lymphoblastic leukemia diagnosed child on a clinical trial, and they agreed to share the data. And very rapidly, we went from a 3% survival rate to a 90% survival rate. Putting the patient at the center really does bring traction.
I like your point about not wanting to be a subject. I don't want to be subjected to research, and I think it really is a sea change in how we view participation in research and thinking about patients and participants truly as partners in that undertaking. You also raised the issue of clinical trials and access to clinical trials. Bob, you've done a lot of work in trying to make data from clinical trials accessible. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Sure. I think one of the things that I hope that Greg and the team of the Cancer Moonshot will do, and Greg, thanks for taking the assignment. It's an exciting time to have you leading this initiative. But one of the things that I hope that that initiative can help bring a focus to is the value of being able to share data across those who are looking to understand and find ways to improve the treatment of this disease. And for example, one of the groups I'm affiliated with, I'm the chairman of the CEO Roundtable on Cancer, which has as one of its initiatives something known as Project Datasphere. And the idea is, right to your point about patients not wanting to be subjects, the idea is to make the control arms of cancer experiment data available in a digital lab so that scientists around the world can interrogate these data, and so that over time we might get to a point where regulators don't require a control arm in cancer development trials, so that patients who enroll know that they're on a treatment arm that has the potential to be better than what's otherwise available, and not simply being relegated to the control arm where they may not be getting the benefit of the latest, greatest advances in the field of cancer research. So we're unabashedly encouraging our friends and colleagues who are funded by the government and are part of the academic institutions to make their data available. I'm pleased with the response that the corporate entities have made so far, and a few of the academic institutions, but there's more progress to be made, and I think this is a great example of where the federal government can help try to encourage the trials that are funded, for example, by NCI, to be included in this data arm sooner rather than later, and my hope is that that digital lab will make us able to advance the field more rapidly than we would be able to do without that, and I feel certain we will.
You know, Greg made the point about acknowledging that we have some shortcomings in how we conduct our business, and I think certainly in the data sharing arena, you've talked a little bit about patient level data and sharing of patient level data, but even for aggregate data from clinical trials, a law was passed in 2006 that said you have to share that data, and here we are in 2016, and the compliance rate for doing that is embarrassing, right? So, you know, I'm the NIH and I have a problem in that we are not doing a good job in making sure that people actually share the data that taxpayers paid for to create. And so we got to do a better job, and we're committed to doing that. Isla, as an academic researcher, sitting there on the ground level, working hard at the next generation of breakthroughs and insights and understanding, what do you see as sort of the barriers to you and your colleagues being able to progress? And then speak a little bit from your perspective about the incentives and disincentives for really sharing data early and often.
Right. So I think one of the barriers that we all kind of face in time is kind of related to adapting some of the new findings coming out of the clinical trials. So how does that data get disseminated? How do we encourage colleagues that we work around with who are not necessarily so as academic to utilize these new findings and really integrate them into the patient care? So one of the hopes, I think, of the Moonshot is really to figure out how to disseminate this information so that it's integrated everywhere in our practices. And the other thing I think too is related to clinical trials and the fact that only a few percentage of our patients are participating is having a continued learning. So once the clinical trial is complete and there's a new kind of method or protocol for treating patients out there, we should be able to harness all this data from patients who are now going to go on these new protocols and continue to learn from it. So basically we're going to know who responds and who doesn't respond, and if we could kind of feed that back in real time, we can make our practice more personalized. So I think there's a lot of issues related to data sharing that are very important in terms of kind of honing, what's already out there.
Right. So I'm going to turn to my colleagues. Anna, formerly at the National Cancer Institute, and Michelle, currently at NCI. I'd be interested in your perspectives about both how the blueprint, sort of the scientific research blueprint for the Moonshot is being created with the Blue Ribbon panel, sort of how's that going? And then where do you see the biggest opportunities and obstacles in terms of business as we've been doing it at the NIH and at the Cancer Institute for many, many years, what could we do differently in terms of innovative ways of funding high risk, high reward kinds of research? So I'll let you guys go in whatever order you want to.
So my perspective may be a little different because I always complained incessantly about the government until I went to the government. So and I realized how hard it is to actually get things done and what a fine group of people actually comprise these institutes. But when I was there, I was, I think, fortunate. I got to do and design a lot of very interesting programs that actually required a very high level of data sharing. The Cancer Genome Atlas, which involved well over 60, 70 institutions and maybe 350 or 400 investigators. A nanotechnology initiative, similar kind of data sharing. A proteomics initiative, similar kind of data sharing. And what I found was that, you're absolutely right, Kathy. I mean, there are still, you remember how we reward academic investigators? We reward them for papers that they publish and grants that they get. And so we're actually rewarding the wrong behavior here. And data sharing, you hold your data till you're sure that you're going to be the first out there with the data. And that actually encourages a behavior that's really not conducive with getting all of your data into the database. And we even the Cancer Genome Atlas, which turned out to be a remarkable project, it was difficult to get people to believe that if they shared their data, it was going to make a huge difference. And it has, and it does. But what I found is if the idea is big enough and good enough, and it's really going to impact patients, Lou, to your point, the scientists are there and they'll share their data. I think we had more conversations about this in the government than I ever want to remember. How do we change the reward structure in the academic environments to get these investigators who are really trapped in terms of how they are required to behave, essentially? And it's all about publishing and getting grants, and that behavior is what's rewarded. And somehow or other, we have got to start giving people credit for sharing their data.
So our chief data scientist at the NIH has talked about, first of all, creating a data commons where you can there's an easy place to put your data with all sorts of metadata tags, et cetera. But also that would be a citable entity so that publishers would allow citations to a data set. Yeah. You know, when we started data sharing back in the Genome Project days, it was a real tour de force to get people to share their data in real time, 24 hours after you've generated the sequence, it had to be deposited.
Right.
And that was, in some ways, a limited set of participants, so you only had to twist so many arms. But that data wasn't really citable, right? And so do you think that would be
Yes.
one tool in the toolbox here?
That's a fabulous idea. We finally got the Cancer Genome Atlas data in the cloud last year. And up to that point, it wasn't that easy to get to the data. I mean, try to download a whole genome sequence sometime. You'll find out that it's nearly impossible. Certainly even for an average or an investigator that's working in the lab pretty regularly. So I think that's a terrific idea. And but the vice president made this comment at AACR a few weeks ago that we're still, because of the way journals are treating the data, it's still difficult to get the data out for about a year, essentially, once you publish. So he was really railing against that in terms of changing that behavior amongst the journals. And so I have to say, of all the things that we can talk about today, if we could make the laboratories interoperable, if we could connect the laboratories to essentially the care system, if we could connect back to the kinds of things that we do in clinical trials, this is the only industry I know that has gotten a pass on being interoperable and sharing data. It's got to change.
I had not really appreciated the value, because I've always had open access to all the medical literature because of where I've been in my professional career. When my brother-in-law got diagnosed with prostate cancer, my sister, who's like, got to learn everything, got to map a path, got to know everything, got to make lists of pros and cons, she called me and asked for, can I help point her to the literature? So I did a bunch of searches and sent her a bunch of links to all of the mostly review papers about surgical versus non-surgical, blah, blah, blah. I sent it to her, and we'd have these late night conversations and talking about these different approaches. And I realized, it was only then that I realized that she was only going from the abstracts, right? That was the only thing that she could read was the abstracts. And it became very vivid to me, this sort of insane policy of keeping from the people who could most benefit from access to this information, not being able to get it. It was really quite vivid for me. Michelle, talk to us about where we are with the Blue Ribbon Panel and how that process looks, and how can we all in this room and our colleagues weigh in?
Sure, be happy to. So the Blue Ribbon Panel really sits at the heart of the idea generation process. There have been 28 individuals who have been named to the Blue Ribbon Panel, and they really represent cancer expertise from across the continuum: basic research, prevention research, population research, clinical research. And they in turn have started to, those different areas that you mentioned, those topic areas, 2 of them are serving as co-chairs for the different working groups, and an additional 10 to 12 people are being invited to participate in the working group discussions. So all in all, we'll have probably around 120, 130 people who will be on these different groups generating ideas. And so what we're looking for is about 2 to 3 ideas from each of the topic areas that will be then considered by the Blue Ribbon Panel. The Blue Ribbon Panel will be selecting about 10 of those then to move forward, and they will be presented to the National Cancer Advisory Board. So that's the advisory board that makes recommendations to the NCI director. And so that's how these ideas will be bubbling up. We're really very interested in making sure that people around the country have the opportunity to provide input. And so in addition to the Blue Ribbon Panel and the working groups, we also have started an idea platform that anybody can contribute to. It's if you were to Google cancer research ideas in quotes, your first link should be to that platform. And we invite participation by anybody. Some of the ideas submitted to that platform have already been put forward to the Blue Ribbon Panel. We review them regularly, and we make sure they're heading that direction. So.
Michelle, what's the timeline for the generation of a report back to the National Cancer Advisory Board, and then in turn that will be passed up to the task force? What's the time sequence there?
So that's a great question, and I think it follows nicely too from what are we doing differently. I mean, we really do have an ambitious timeline, and so we're really looking to have a report completed by the end of the summer. So the working groups will be working furiously over the next month, having meetings to generate their initial ideas, and then the Blue Ribbon Panel will be picking those up, so that by the very end of this year, the report will be able to be presented to the task force.
Right. So in the panel earlier today that Margaret Anderson moderated, she confessed that she didn't understand sports metaphors and analogies, but you know, the president has used one that I find particularly motivating, which is that we're in the 4th quarter and interesting things can happen in the 4th quarter. We're all, or some of us anyway, are sort of looking at our watches and thinking about how little time we have left, and yet that gives a clarity of focus and motivation to really getting things done. This process of bringing together the best and brightest thinkers from academia, private sector, patient representatives, into a intense effort to work together to come up with a bold and audacious plan. That's sort of a playbook that we've used now a couple of times. We used it with the Brain Initiative. We used it with the Precision Medicine Initiative that Kathy Giusti participated in. And so I have really great expectations for generating a plan that can be just the constant a resource that people go back to say this is where we're supposed to be going. I think one of the challenging things about it though is this mechanistic thing, and Greg gets back to what you raised of how can you do things in new and different ways rather than the time cycle that we normally use, and at least at NIH, where from the time you have a great idea, you take a long time to write it down, then you send us your great ideas, and then we ponder your great ideas for a really long time. And then about a year later, we give you money, right?
No, not enough money.
We give you some amount of money.
Never enough money.
I'm going to turn over.
So
Yeah,
Kathy,
jump in.
in terms of accelerating, nothing brings a sense of urgency more than having patients involved. The patients bring that sense of urgency. Blood cancer patients don't want to wait for a cure; they want it now. Right. And you know, look, I'm struck being here at the Milken conference. In any other industry, the customer is king. Yeah. customer data is gold, but we don't involve the ultimate customer. We don't think about the outcome that patients want when we're thinking about designing a clinical trial or what research the National Institute should be funding. That needs to happen more, and when you engage the patient more, the sense of urgency is going to be there as well.
Well, and Lou, you mentioned earlier about just even how if scientists by themselves in a without that kind of input are designing what are the questions and what will be the way in which we go about answering those questions, it may not be the way that is going to get people to really participate, right? I mean, we need the voices and those perspectives at the table to begin.
I'll take you back to the dialogue that the AML patients had with the FDA. Dr. Pazder asked, what are your preferences? How do you evaluate risk versus benefit? How do you think about your tolerance for a particular toxicity or a side effect versus the efficacy of the drug? And the patients clearly had thoughts about that. So if you want to design a clinical trial that's going to enroll patients, you need to think about and encourage and listen to the patient view. The endpoints that we design in clinical trials very frequently have nothing to do with what's important to a patient.
Here, here.
No wonder they don't enroll.
Yeah.
I think that's a message, if I may quickly, I think
Yeah,
that's a
please.
message that, that FDA hears loud and clear, and industry's working closely with FDA on bringing the patient voice in. And,
Yeah.
and one of the really important trends for those of us who invest heavily in innovating in this particular area is the role that the patient groups are playing now and helping us as well understand what we need to solve for the benefit of the patients. But, again, I think this is a ball that is rolling and rolling pretty productively right now.
If I could comment though, it's more than that. We need new clinical trials models. I mean, the way we're asking questions today takes about 15 years, and a single hypothesis, a single drug, a single control arm. So one thing we did when I was at NCI is to set up a trial called the I-SPY2 trial, which we did through the Foundation for the NIH, but it allows us to test many drugs, and you can actually do this with the very innovative FDA that we have, essentially under a master protocol, which means that you don't have to go back and recreate your wheel every time you want to change drugs. And it puts the patient squarely at the center, essentially, because the patients are involved in the design and at every stage. And if a drug doesn't work for a patient, you move on to another drug. And if a drug does work, you actually expand that population. So I think, trials like I-SPY2 and LungMap, which was done recently, and MATCH, these are all trials that give patients an entirely new approach and allows us to learn quickly. We don't have any learning systems here in our clinical trials. I mean, essentially, I think, Bob, that's what you were alluding to, is we don't have these large databases that allow us to learn from 20 or 50 different clinical trials. And, I think the new clinical trials models are probably as important as anything I've seen in terms of changing this entire field. And I love it, I guess, because I'm involved in it, but it's interesting to see how many drugs we've gone through, for example, in I-SPY2 and graduated to go on to phase 3 trials in what would have taken probably 25 years to do if we'd done it the old way.
Well, and Anna, in I-SPY and MATCH and LungMap and these others, those trials have really benefited by the participation of the companies who are willing to provide their compounds, their drugs, their biologics, right?
Yes.
So Bob, can you talk a little bit about what are there barriers? I think there was a perception that companies would be unwilling to have their drug in a head-to-head or even in a combination with some other company's drugs, but it seems like we've turned a corner there, and that there's.
So I think we're making progress. I think one of the challenges we have in the field right now is that there is so much innovation underway. I think the last I looked, I think there were on the order of 25 to 30 immuno-oncology agents undergoing clinical development in something like 250 clinical trials across 20 different disease states. So, the combinatorics of this challenge are profound. And so I think we are cooperating with each other and with the academic community and with government in ways that might have been harder to imagine a decade or so ago. But I think there's more and more of that happening now. And I hope, Kathy, just if you allow me one moment, when you talked about some of the examples of where government has worked well to catalyze change in the field of science, in my experience, there's nowhere where that happened more profoundly than the Human Genome Project. And that was government, industry, academia working together, not just in the US, but globally.
Yeah.
And to me, the real benefit of the Human Genome Project was not the reference sequence, but the incredible productivity that it unleashed downstream of that, decade-long effort. So, if you look back on it, it was actually a small drop in the bucket in terms of the amount of resource that was placed into the field of human genetics, but it has unleashed an incredible period of productivity in this profound field. And I hope that part of what the Moonshot will do is catalyze downstream a decade from now that kind of enormous progress by having moved all of us to a similar starting point at the same time.
I wonder if I could build on
Go
that
ahead.
just a little bit. You made a couple of comments that I think are really pivotal, and that over the last 45 years, we really have made a lot of research progress. And the excitement in the areas of immunotherapy are, I think everybody can relate to that. But that wouldn't have been possible without the investments in basic research over the last 2 to 3 decades. And so I think for me, and I think for the NCI, what that underscores is we can't forget that we need to continue to fund basic research in order to get to those advances down the line.
Yeah, strongly support that view.
Hear,
I think
hear.
it concerns us in industry to see the push on you to move towards translational research when what we really need is support for the basic science, and we'll let the broader community try to translate that into clinical applications. But
Actually, the basic science was done just about in the 1970s that is actually producing these advances today. So it's
Kathy,
taken that long.
let me punctuate that with a real example. So one of the foundational immunotherapies, CAR T therapy,
Yeah.
that really made a big splash in
Yeah.
the last few years. To Anna's point, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Societies began funding that work in 1998 and had invested $20 million by 2012 when the breakthrough really became public. We have a tendency to, we see these advances, it's a little bit like a pop singer with a breakout hit. But when you really look back at how long they practiced their craft, they had practiced their craft for 20 years before they had that breakout hit. This is what research is like to get new, groundbreaking transformational therapies into the healthcare arena.
Immunotherapy indeed has been supported for a very long time and is now really showing quite a bit of promise. And it's interesting to me to think about sort of the major breakthroughs in health and disease and how frequently it is utilizing our own immune system to help out rather than taking something from outside. Your comment about basic research and the really the importance of continuing that strong investment. NIH continues to invest about 50% of our budget in basic research. There has been an incentive or a perceived advantage to people who try to dress up like translational researchers. And in order to try to offset that or counterbalance that, there is in a grant application a place where you're supposed to say like how this is going to affect public health. And we're actually changing that. So it's, how is this going to influence how is what you're proposing to do going to increase our understanding of how things work? Not necessarily you working on a worm or a fly or yeast have to understand how that might someday affect a human. So that may take some of the pressure off. I'm going to, in a minute, ask everybody up here to pretend that they have a magic wand and that they get to insert something into the Blue Ribbon Panel's report or into the minds of the Moonshot Task Force. Sort of what, if you had a magic wand and you could have one thing happen as a result of this moonshot, what would that be? And after we do that, then we're going to open it up for your questions and comments. And so I think there will be or is a microphone around that can be accessible to you all. So Isla, maybe starting with you, if you had a magic wand and now the moonshot is launched, and what is it that you'd most like to see come out of the moonshot?
I think the change in mindset, as you're saying, in terms of how we do things, this whole global picture of cancer research, how we change our mindset so it's not competition, it's sharing, so that it's the clinical trial design is different so that we can achieve goals that are more centered around that patient. So I think that's what I'd like to see. The change in mindset, not so much the money. I mean, the money will be great, but it's more the change in mindset.
Yeah. Lou?
So I think I'd like to see the Moonshot adopt a strategy that not-for-profits have used for a very long time, and that is utilize the convening power that the Moonshot will have to bring together all of the important stakeholders in the area of innovation for cancer treatment. The Moonshot has the capability of bringing together academic research, biotech and pharma, the regulatory agencies, the payers, as well as patients and treating physicians. Using that convening power, I think would be a major advantage that the Moonshot could bring to the efforts that are underway.
And from that convening, being able to come up with ideas that wouldn't have been arrived at in other venues by ourselves? Or?
In part, and just an alignment. So we've been talking a little bit, we've made reference to the power of teamwork here. We all know if you've been on a sports team or you've worked in a company, teamwork is vital. We don't do teamwork particularly well in the research industry, and if we could bring, if the Moonshot could bring us together as a team and align goals and objectives, and very clear goals and objectives, we could accelerate the rate at which new therapies are developed.
Bob?
Well, I think if I could wave my wand, it would be to give those that are part of the Moonshot the courage to recognize that it's not what happens inside the Moonshot that will really matter, but what happens downstream from it. And so again, I go back to the Human Genome Project, and we've had, just since that reference genome was published, we've had a billionfold, with a B, a billionfold increase in the productivity of genetic sequencing. That's a profound rate of change that was catalyzed by this human genome effort. And if we're so lucky with the Moonshot that it pulls stakeholders together and catalyzes a decade or two from now that kind of productivity, hallelujah.
Yeah. You know, you talked about public-private partnerships in the Human Genome Project and beyond, and one of the things that the task force has focused on and looking for new opportunities and new ways to build public-private partnerships. We at NIH several years ago created a partnership with a number of companies where we put money on the table, they put money on the table to create needed data that will be rapidly available and useful to everybody, called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, focused in 3 disease areas. Cancer was not one of those. We're now sort of re-upping, looking at a new partnership like that called the Partnership for Advancing Cancer Therapeutics. I think your R&D guy has been talking to us about that, seeing whether or not there's some interesting opportunities for the government and private sector and patient groups to work together in ways that might not have been quite so easy in the past. So if people are interested in that, please let me know, because we're in the process of collecting those ideas and collecting the interested people to participate in that. Okay, so I'm going to pass the wand down to you, Michelle.
Thank you. So I think if I had a magic wand, if the NCI had a magic wand, it would really be to speed progress, really dramatically be able to take those ideas and get them into practice a lot faster so that we can decrease mortality. I think after all, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about patients. What are we trying to do? We want to decrease mortality for adults and for children who are affected by cancer.
Anna.
So I need a really big wand, actually. So I think what I would probably focus on is the exceptional opportunities that the Vice President highlights as something that he would like to see us focus on. They're out there. I had one just quick example. When I left the NCI, I have a long time interest in GBM. As serendipitously, that's the disease that took the Vice President's son's life last year. But we sequenced it. The first tumor we sequenced in the Cancer Genome Atlas was that tumor. So it's the best molecularly characterized tumor we have, but we still don't have any treatments for it. It's still, the median survival is still 50% essentially at 6 months. And so I got a small group together to say, what can we do about this? And a little over a year later, we have 140 people crowdsourcing a new adaptive trial. Raising our money from philanthropy. And so these exceptional opportunities are out there, and I think we really need to enable them. There's a fine line between innovation and insanity, but you know, we want to give those exceptional opportunities some real attention, and it's hard for us to actually do that in the systems that we have.
So we're going to open up the floor now for your comments and questions. If you could tell us your name and what organization you're with, that would be useful. Is there a microphone roaming around? Who's got the microphone? Greg's going to be my MC.
Tom Khalil with the White House. So building on your observation about the impact of the Human Genome Project, one of the things that NIH did was to not only to sequence the human genome, but to set a goal of driving down the cost of doing that to $1,000. So recognizing that this is really a complex systems problem and that there's no one silver bullet, do you see opportunities like that or metrics that the Cancer Moonshot should be thinking about to increase the chance that 10 years from now there would be this sort of massive follow-on effect?
My view would be that speed is the issue here, and I start from the perspective that it's the economic burden of cancer, which is a disease largely of the elderly, that we as a society and frankly as a globe need to be concerned about. And I think what we want to do is become more adaptable and be able to move projects more quickly from the idea stage to the point where we have the definitive experiment in hand and we know whether it works or not. And I think there are some ways to do that, and I think we ought to have an audacious goal. $1,000 wasn't audacious enough, by the way. But I think we ought to have some audacious goals about how quickly we can move from the stage of an idea that makes sense to the point where we have the definitive answer in clinical trials. And again, I think part of the magic of the Human Genome Project was it wasn't just the NIH, with all due respect, which was critical, but it was a global initiative. And it may be that when it comes to the moonshot, it may be there's an opportunity to bring in some other entities outside of the United States to try and address this, in particular, this challenge of moving more quickly from idea to proof of concept.
Great.
I'd add dramatically raising the number of patients who enroll in clinical trials. Really, it's the clinical trial that allows us to make an advance and new therapy. And if that's the goal, then raising the number of patients that are enrolling in trials is critical as a metric.
Or drug approvals. I mean, last year we approved 15 drugs for cancer, dramatic increase. I mean, that's going to go up, and we should really be aggressive there, and combinations of therapies as well.
And if I could add one more thing, I think we need to be mindful of the economic burden for all people who are diagnosed with cancer. And so that might be an issue that's a little bit beyond NCI, but I think as a community, if we're all thinking about that, we might be able to address that together.
I think you have the mic, so you get to speak.
Thank you. John Reed Roche. Real world data. I wonder if some of the panelists could talk about the opportunities and challenges of harvesting real world data for aiding particularly clinical trials and clinical decision making, and particularly touch on harmonizing data standards for electronic medical records and other types of data. Just a few comments would be appreciated.
So the NCI has an effort, the Genomic Data Commons, that will be launched on June 1st. And this will be an effort to bring together the genomic data from clinical trials that are being funded by NCI. We use that as an initial platform, and we hope to build on that dramatically.
The other thing that's becoming clear, though, is that how many people in the room have a Fitbit or something like a Fitbit? Of course. So I just chaired a panel on this a few weeks ago, and this is a huge challenge. How are we going to bring that set of data together with the EMRs, together with the data on these diseases? And patients expect that data to be used now. And so does FDA. FDA is trying to sort out how to use that data. So data's coming from everywhere, John. I mean, it's everywhere.
John, I think that's a really great question. I want to expand the definition of real-world data. Yeah. So, as you probably know, with chronic myeloid leukemia, time and again in clinical trials, it's been shown that 90% of newly diagnosed patients go into a very deep and durable remission. In the real world, in the United States, if you look at the SEER data, fewer than 45% of CML patients maintain a remission that lasts longer than 5 years. What does that mean? And we really have to dig, that's some real world data that we need to dig into and understand better, because those patients should be doing much better.
Well, and John, you raised the point about electronic medical records. You know, there's been this elusive utility of electronic medical records and the availability of that data to individual patients through a magical blue button that you can push and poop, you get your data. That's largely been aspirational, and we need to turn it into a reality for a couple reasons. First of all, EMRs were developed for payment purposes, and we need to make them useful for treatment purposes and for care. And the second is we need to make them useful for research. And so we need to have a system in which individuals can say, I want my data, and I want to be able to donate it for research. So I want to be a data donor, I want to sync for science, I want to contribute it to a research group or a researcher in order to advance work. And that's really got to move forward. It's been really thrilling to watch how different parts of government and the private sector have stepped up, in part because of the challenge with the Precision Medicine Initiative. But it's obviously going to be of benefit across the board for research if we can actually get electronic medical records to be a research tool. I moved my mom from Texas to St. Paul about 1.5 years ago, and when I did that, I had to go to all of her, she has many, many chronic conditions, I had to go to all of her providers who would only give me paper copies of her medical records. And so when I drove her car up, I had boxes in the back of her van of her medical records. That was not helpful for me in taking care of her. So we gotta do better. I think the microphone is in the middle here.
My name is Jackie Brandwin, and I function in 2 areas. I write a column on healthcare, which reaches about 5 million people, but I also help in the development of new cancer companies. And in the first part, one of the things I hear from a lot of companies is they would like to have more access to consumer regarding their trials. I hear that an awful lot, but it's very difficult to find where are trials, how to get into them, and all that. So I think information about trials ought to be more accessible to the general public. That's number one. In the other side, where we develop, my partner and I develop cancer companies, we have to be very aware of what the fashion is in Wall Street and what they will support or not support. For example, 14 years ago, we decided to develop a company for glioblastoma multiforme in immunology. Well, immunology was not very attractive to Wall Street at that time, and we had a very hard time raising money for that company. So if there could be more dialogue with you people and the Wall Street community, the financial community, that would be very helpful, so that if there is real innovation, and immunology now is extremely attractive, but it certainly wasn't 13 years ago, that would help.
Thank you.
I'm going to democratize the microphone and move it over to this side. We're going to start up here.
So let me just mention in response to that question that there are organizations like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society that help patients connect with clinical trials. So we run a clinical trial matching service. And when a patient calls us and expresses an interest in joining a clinical trial, we help them navigate clinicaltrials.gov to find trials they might be eligible for. And we help educate them about how to have a conversation with their physician about joining a clinical trial. I think those kinds of activities have to happen more and more broadly across all of cancer, but it's a beginning.
And foundations like the Lazarex Foundation, just to choose one, that help take those that might not have the economic ability to be able to go to a city where one of these trials is being run, and help support them to do that. So there are resources available. It does require a little bit of digging to find them.
You could even call the NCI, actually. I mean, if you're looking for a trial, and they'll help you find a trial as well. And most of the survivors groups now have that, that matching service.
Greg Zuckerman, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Everyone seemed to talk about immunotherapy, adaptive techniques, and the promise. Obviously, people for over 100 years have been looking into immunotherapy. What was it that each of you became convinced? When did you become convinced that this was as promising as it looks like right now? Was there a piece of data? Was there some event? And what are you concerned about going forward, that maybe there's too much hype in the area?
Well, I can. I think for me, it was, yes, there's pieces of data that all kind of came together in different facets of immunotherapy. For example, there's designing immune cells that can actually target and fight the cancer, which was a huge impact, and seeing people with large amounts of tumor burden, all of a sudden it melt away, by having these designer T cells. And the other thing is that was a big finding was how you unleash the immune system on cancer by taking the pedal off the brakes, essentially. Mm-hmm. So these checkpoint inhibitors that are now in use for some cancers have been showing so much promise. So I think these two pieces really came together and made us realize that, wow, we really can unleash the immune system on cancer and make a difference.
So much, though, had to be learned about the immune system. My degree is in immunology, and I started in immunotherapy I won't say when I started, but a long time ago. But, we didn't even know then, what a T cell was or, what the T cell receptor was. This has all happened in the last 30 years. And the other thing I'll say is the government's played a major role here because if you take the checkpoint inhibitors, those antibodies were made by the government, essentially. I mean, the people, our investigators are getting lots and lots of attention for that now. But had it not been for the NCI, those antibodies would never have been made. They're too expensive for an investigator to make. So they were made through the RAID program at the National Cancer Institute to do the phase 1 trials and the scale-up of that. And the last thing I'll say is I wish, we could say that everybody responds to immunotherapy, but obviously they don't. So we need to learn more about biomarkers. I think that's the major stumbling block we have in the entire sort of therapeutic, directions we're trying to take right now, and I'm hoping that that's going to get on the radar screen.
And to wrap that up, I think I said this before, but I'll say it again, is basic science. The commitment to basic science is really important.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
I'm not sure where the microphone is. Oh, right there.
To pick up the question about the basic science investment, my name is Laura Kalmus-Nasser. I am a professor. I study integrative, cross-sectoral integration in healthcare systems. But I wanted to talk a little bit about stories from the trenches. I'm also a nurse. I worked in pediatric bone marrow cancer as well as bone marrow transplant as well as pediatric cancer. I've watched children die with their parents begging for something, anything to happen. I'm also an investor. I've invested in a company called Biomarker, which looks at peptides and has discovered through the research at the academic level a drug that seems to, in a non-toxic manner, stop metastasis. What I've seen happen is I watched this small researcher in a small lab and academia beg for funds from his institution to just try to continue a few more trials. I've watched him and the firm go to the neighborhood and literally ask for a few thousand from local citizens. And then what? Big data is fantastic. I think EMRs is going to completely change what we do. But how do we get discoveries out of the trenches and patient care out of the trenches? Because those pieces aren't being connected. We're waiting for big pharma to discover things, but it's actually passionate scientists working in a lab who don't have a marketing machine to turn out a drug. So it's more of a question. How do we reach into those discoverers and turn them into drugs that get to patients?
Is that a question? I don't know anybody today that I think is really a really aggressive investigator that doesn't start a company. I mean, frankly, everyone that I know practically out there in the academic world has started a company because they see the vision of getting their idea out there. And so many of them are taking the initiative, as I say, almost everyone I know. And I think that's one approach. The other approach, obviously, is enlightened philanthropy today is funding those kinds of investigators, I think, more and more. And so I think there are different avenues than just the government.
So we have about 5 minutes left, so if we can be quick on both ends, the questions and the responses, that'd be great.
I'm Mike Hiltzik. I'm from the Los Angeles Times. Could you expand a little bit on some of what you've said about the obstacles to data sharing, particularly the extent to which proprietary interest, whether it's the interest of journals and holding on to data that's been submitted to them, or companies that have a proprietary interest in husbanding the data that they get, how much that has to do with the fact as an obstacle to more data sharing.
So I'll start and talk a little bit about clinical trial data sharing. So it is currently required by law that anybody doing a clinical trial, phase 2 or 3 clinical trial, must submit their aggregate data from their trial of a FDA-regulated drug or device to clinicaltrials.gov. There has been an increase in compliance, but it is still far, far below 100%. And for NIH, we have proposed and will implement this summer a requirement that all clinical trials, whether they're of FDA-regulated drugs or devices, so behavioral interventions, for example, and phase 1 studies that are funded by us, must submit their aggregate data into clinicaltrials.gov and register when they open the trial. And there's been talk here about, are trials accessible to people? Can they find them? And frankly, our clinical trials interface is not particularly user-friendly. So if you go on and try to do a search for clinical trials with rheumatoid arthritis in St. Paul, you will get back a hodgepodge of stuff. So that's not particularly helpful. So we really have to push on that, and we're going to be pushing on that as we finalize these rules. Bob talked about sharing patient-level data. That gets more complicated. But then there's tons of data from preclinical work that needs to be out there too. And so we need, maybe we need something analogous to clinicaltrials.gov, but for preclinical data that gets it out there in a way that can be rapidly accessed and computed upon, but also so that the people who generate the data generators, can get credit for it. It's sometimes proprietary interest, and Bob, maybe you can comment on that, but more often it's about credit. So it's not about IP interest so much, it's about my career, my advancement, my tenure, my next grant is dependent upon me owning and having my name on this data set. And so that's the challenge, I think, that we need to overcome.
Thank you. I think that was a very objective summary, and again, I think there are different reasons why the corporate entities may have been able to move a little bit more quickly here than the government or the academic entities. But I think it's in all of our interest to find a way to make the data available and to allow the data to be publicly interrogated. The thing I would add to that is that we also need to be able to put data out there, and when it isn't replicable, when we can't verify it with subsequent downstream experiments, create an opportunity to talk about why that is. And so, we've been an advocate, some of you may have seen our essay on this in Science. We've been an advocate for making creating an open forum where people can try to figure out why certain experiments are hard to replicate when we go and try to verify the initial findings. And it's not just a case of investigator fraud. There are a whole variety of different things in play there. But again, if we're going to advance the field, we have to be able to interrogate those data openly in the preclinical as well as the clinical setting.
Well, and that's this issue of lack of replicability, the inability to reproduce preclinical research findings is something we focus a lot of time on, and now really asking investigators who are proposing research in the preclinical field that they have to have a really robust statistical plan in advance. I mean, the fact that people were doing research where they weren't blinding the evaluation of the mice in their studies, I mean, that's just as reprehensible in preclinical work as it would be in a clinical trial. So we, I think, are making real progress. Quick question, and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead.
Expand a little bit the definition of preclinical data here. There's the data that's published, and maybe there are some issues around replicability there. But many experiments get done and don't lead to a publishable result.
Yes.
And we never see that data.
That's right.
So very frequently there's great value in an experiment that's failed.
Absolutely.
And we need to find a way to unlock the notebooks that have that data, because I think that keeps us from making the same mistake again in the future.
Yeah. Super fast.
And Noah Kraft, the CEO of Science 37, physician scientist, formerly at UCLA. One comment is to focus the discussion, we talk about unlocking access to the data, but our company was created to solve the problem of unlocking access to the trials. So we know that 90% of people want to participate in these trials, and we know that the searching mechanisms get better and better. Our company actually is delivering the entire trial to the patient through telemedicine. And so we've launched entire telemedicine-based randomized controlled trials into 7 entire states, demonstrating it can be done, is many, many-fold, exponentially faster than the current system. And next month, we're about to launch a trial, oncology-targeted trial across the entire state of California. So this idea of unlocking access to the trial through telemedicine is what we're focused on, and it really disrupts the site-based model, bringing the trial to the patient, the reverse of what the Lazarus Foundation does, bring the trial, bring the patient to the trial.
Yeah.
So my question is to the group is how can we encourage regulatory input to make telemedicine laws more supportive of this model? We're demonstrating it quite effectively at the behest of Big Pharma and biotech to create a path for that individual cure to get to the patient much faster.
Yes.
Any thoughts on that?
You know, my quick reaction to that, and I'll let Anna make a quick response, and then we're going to wrap up. The real great thing about taking a trial to the patient rather than making them come to you is we have huge health disparities across all of medicine, but obviously particularly in cancer, and being able to reach people who are not near an academic medical center or a major tertiary care facility really can help us really address some of those pressing health disparities issues.
I think this is going to be one of the biggest advances in medicine coming. And as you point out, we're right on the leading edge of it, but FDA is probably the most innovative player in the space, to be honest with you. And I think we're going to have to train our investigators how to use these tools, but I think it's going to be one of the biggest advances we see in the next 5 to 10 years.
So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning for an interesting conversation. Please join me in thanking our panel.